Hello? 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 Yes, I'm going to talk. Okay, guys, we're gonna wait probably about 5 more minutes, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. We're gonna go ahead and cover chapter 19. So if you want to follow along on your study guide, we're just gonna cover a few things here, kind of hit the high notes. Brian, we went over chapter 18, part 2, and then we did kind of a short little writing prompt comparing both uh, W.E.B. Du Bois and why does his name escape me right now? Booker T. Washington. Okay, we got about 18 people watching here, so I guess we're gonna go ahead and get started. So, just popping open the study guide. So remember, you should be reading chapter 19, the rise and reform of industrial cities. So we're gonna go over a few things here. We're gonna talk about, Joseph Pulitzer, yellow journalism, muckrakers, right? And you can use some of this for those of you who are in my class, you can use some of this for the Gilded Age newspaper project, right? So make sure to keep all this in mind. We're going to go ahead and talk about political machines a little bit, talk about how they were taking advantage of the situation at the height of the Gilded Age, right? And then we're going to talk about the reactions to some of the corruption that was going on. So we'll talk about the progressive era reform, right? And then we'll talk about muckrakers like Upton Sinclair and how he had made a major impact during this time period. Can everyone hear me? I'm just making sure. Oh no. Okay. So we're gonna go ahead and cover a few things here about the progressive movement. So let's talk about it. So, what was the progressive movement, right? So, talking about the progressive movement, it's a very popular movement from the 1890s and the 1920s, and what everyone has to remember and what everyone has to realize is that this is all a reaction to what's going on during the Gilded Age, right? So some of you may have seen some of this because we kind of went over it in class, right? So this is the reaction to the people living in the cities about the political and economic injustices that were going on from America's industrialization. Because remember, last time we talked about how technology always brings about change, right? And that change isn't always good. That change can sometimes be good, but it can also be sometimes bad. Um, So they believe that big businesses, the progressives, they believe that businesses and industry had corrupted the government. Because if you everyone remembers looking at some of the political cartoons, if you studied a little bit about the Gilded Age, right, or you did your reading, you'll know that there is a perception that robber barons or industrialists that were kind of known as robber barons, that were bribing government officials, that they were using their powerful wealth in order to kind of get their way during this time period. Okay, so does anyone have any questions so far? Before I move on here, this general gist about what the progressive movement is. if you look at this particular political cartoon, right? So at the very top, you'll see capitalism at the top, right? So the idea that capitalism or making money should be everything, right? And then it says here, we rule you, right? So the politicians, businessmen, right? We fool you, we shoot at you, we eat for you, and then at the very bottom, right, we work for all and we feed for all. So who's at the bottom here of this social pyramid? Anyone got any ideas? Anyone got ideas who's at the bottom of this social pyramid? Okay, good. So farmers, industrial workers, the lower class, right? So those are the people that are going to be at the bottom here. So that's good. So let's go ahead and move on here. So how did it start? So remember, the progressive era is, or the progressive movement is going to be highly influenced by a couple of things, right? So Protestant evangelicism. Remember, we talked about how the social gospel was this idea that you go out there and you help others because as a good Christian, it is your duty, according to the social gospel, right, that you will go out there to help improve society, right? And of course, we're going to also talk about the activities of the journalists, who are also known as muckrakers, the growing middle class that was growing during the Industrial Revolution, during the Gilded Age, right? That they started to notice that there were these abuses in industry and government that were really, they felt like they were going too far. And remember, we mentioned the populist movement, the Grange movement, the farmers out west. They were the ones who really influenced the progressive movement. So let's go ahead and continue here. So we did talk about this in class. Hopefully, most of you still remember this, right? The social gospel movement. I just mentioned it. It was a movement based off this idea that we got to end things like child labor, that there need to be safer working conditions, right? Remember how we talked about there were many children that were working for almost nothing, right? That factories were kind of factory owners and industrialists were just kind of taking advantage of what was going on at the time. Now, at the same time, do remember that those that followed the social gospel movement, who took part of it, also were really big in supporting the temperance movement, okay, which was the movement to ban alcoholic beverages. All right, and everyone remembers the reason why. The reason why the temperance movement was started was because it originally starts with women, and a lot of women feel that alcohol is a primary cause of domestic violence at home, and so there was a big push by many of them to ban alcohol in the United States at this time. Okay. What am I missing here? Oh yes. So settlement houses, right? So settlement houses were places. They were community centers, essentially, right? They were places where immigrants come to learn English. They provided childcare, nursing services, basically, kind of a place where if you needed anything, right, you could go there and get help. Okay, and many progressives volunteered there because they felt like it was the place to volunteer, essentially. Okay, so this is like one of our viewers have just mentioned. This was the location of the Hull House, a very famous settlement run by Jane Addams. Um, Has anyone here ever volunteered or, you know, been to a place like this? Maybe not as extravagant, but have you ever volunteered or done anything like this? You kind of get an idea of what a settlement house is like. Anyone got any? Anyone ever done this before? Anyone want to share some of their experiences? Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and continue. Okay, now some of the things that were happening, right? Because of, remember, the Gilded Age, um, America at the time, of course, even today, right? It's based off of the idea of capitalism and free enterprise, right? And so many people felt that during this time, that free enterprise and capitalism was allowing industries to take advantage of the people. So there was this growing sentiment that there was different groups of people who favored either socialism or who favored communism. So socialism, it's an economic and a government system where the government controls key industries while still allowing some level of autonomy or freedom, right? So a good example of this would be the United Kingdom today, where the government owns healthcare there, right? Healthcare is ran by them. Or, for example, Canada, where healthcare is the government essentially runs healthcare over there. Meanwhile, here in the United States, the government doesn't own any key industries really. It's more of free enterprise. It's you get to pick and choose what you want, right? For communism, if you don't remember what communism is from world history, remember that communism is this idea that the government essentially has control over all economic activities. And really, a more technically correct way to put it is that the idea should be that everyone is on equal footing and that no one really has um, any kind of leg up on anyone, so to speak. Now, what's important to note here is that many of the progressives really they didn't feel that socialism nor communism were really the answer to their problems. However, one of the key things here is that they still felt that the government needed to step in and do something. Because if the general population, the lower class, the factory workers, farmers, right, if they couldn't do anything, right, then many people felt like it was the government's place or the government's role to kind of put these businesses in check. That is true also. So, uh, one of the one of the things that how should I put this? Hmm. Lots of people felt that communists and socialists were also very much extremists. And many of the progressives, like one of our viewers just said, that they wanted to kind of stay away from that, and they didn't want to be viewed as extreme. Because if you remember us talking about the labor movements from before, right? Many people viewed that the labor movements eventually, because of some things that happened where there was some violence, they felt like these labor unions was a little bit more extreme. So the the progressives are going to be, they didn't really want to be lumped in with any kind of polarizing groups, right? So let's talk about this real quick. These people are very, very important to the progressive movement. They are the muckrakers, right? Muckrakers are really just investigative journalists. They go out there, they investigate either government officials or big businesses, right? They're out there to try and expose the muck, try and find what is really going on. And a lot of them are, they're out there to try and find some level of fairness and justice for the average everyday person. Okay, although sometimes they may or may not have exaggerated a few things, right? So it's it's a, if you've ever seen, if you watch the news, if you've seen like these special feature investigations, you can kind of consider those people, like especially when they go undercover, they try and find out what's really going on. You can kind of think of those people kind of like muckrakers also. So let's talk about some of them that are on your study guide, right? Okay, here's a few famous muckrakers, right? So we got Upton Sinclair. Remember, he is probably the most famous of all the muckrakers, right? He is going to describe the terrible things that are going on in the packaging industry, in particular when it comes to meat, right? In terms of the unsanitary practices, like for example, let's say a fly gets in your meat, right? They package it anyways. Meat was a little bit old, couple weeks old, looks okay, package it anyways. Sometimes you know, they didn't use sanitary practices, such as if you're changing meat from like your one piece of meat on a cutting board, you put it in the package, you're supposed to sanitize that same surface. They didn't do those things. So he's the one who exposes all those things, right? Ida Tarbell, she is going to show the ruthlessness of John D. Rockefeller's business practices, about how he, you know, undercut a lot of his competition, about some of his very, very ruthless business practices. He put people out of jobs. He, essentially monopolized the entire oil industry underneath him. He owned at one point something about 90% of oil at that time period. Frank Norris, he is a muckraker who's going to talk about he's going to write this novel, right? It's called The Octopus. It's a novel that depicts the stranglehold of the railroads over the California farmers, and it's really a depiction of how railroads were doing things like charging farmers more for short-term hauls rather than long-term hauls, and they might give a discount to your local robber baron, right? But this small-time farmer, they may say, hey, look, man, you're gonna have to pay the extra price, right? Like maybe percentage-wise, they would have to pay more. Now Jacob Reese, he's going to be pretty interesting in that he's going to examine the conditions of what many people were living in terms of the cities. So he's going to go in there, he's going to give photographic evidence of the poor conditions that many Americans were living in. Okay? And then, of course, Lincoln Stevens. Okay? If you read the chapter, you'll see he talks about how there's corruption in the city and the state governments, and how they may be getting illegal kickbacks from a few other people around. So okay, so let's go ahead and move on. So does anyone have any questions actually before I move on? Give me a second here while I put a few children here in timeout. We're gonna see here. We'll probably try and go for. Oh, we're gonna go here for about maybe another 20, 30 minutes or so. Okay, so the spotlight's really on the social reformers, right? So there's gonna be many leaders of the progressive movement. Let's just take a look at a few. So we talked about this guy, right? We talked about him, about Du Bois, about how he is one of the founders of the NAACP, and remember, he demands immediate racial equality, right? And he talks about how that there's more. There's more to life. Okay, there's higher aims to life, remember, than just working. Let's go ahead and move to. Okay. Oh, I forgot to go back. So, who did we talk about? Who has the opposing contrast view of Du Bois? Anyone remember? Who says that equality, racial equality, social racial equality will eventually come to us? We just have to work in vocational jobs. All right, good, good. So everyone remembers that. So Booker T. Washington, remember, he's the one who says, "Hey, look, we will eventually get social equality. Remember, we just gotta, do a few things here. We gotta compromise." Does anyone remember? Does anyone remember the compromise that he kind of strikes up? You know what it starts with? It is all right. Okay, so good. So everyone's been keeping up their reading. Good, good, good. All right, so let's talk about a few others here. So we got Jane Addams, right? So Jane Addams, we haven't talked too much about her, but she is going to be the person who creates and lives at her settlement house known as the Hull House. It's very famous, right? She is going to provide the basic services that many people need in order to try and get a steady base, try and get their feet underneath them, and then eventually maybe try and improve their life. Okay, IDB Wells is going to speak out against the terror tactic known as lynching. Right? If you don't, hopefully everyone remembers us talking about this. It's used. This tactic is really used to specifically against African Americans to cause fear, to punish for crimes, and in a way even try and deter many African Americans from voting in elections. Okay, so these are some famous leaders or social reformers during this time period. Now, remember, it's not just going to be reforms in terms of, hey, like, here's what we want, right? There's going to be also government reform, right? So one of the goals of the progressives was that they didn't just want to root out corruption in terms of businesses, right? They also wanted the government to step in, and they also wanted the government to do what they were supposed to do and not really, be too buddy-buddy with all these businesses. So they try their best to try and change things at every level, right? So most of the municipal level abuses, as in at the town or the city level, are usually centered around political machines, okay? And one of the most famous political machines is headed by a guy named William Boss Tweed, right? And he will head the political machine known as Tammany Hall. And they are the ones who, they do some things that you could consider positive, right? So, They kind of work with the immigrants. They give them jobs. They say, hey, we'll help you out. We'll find you a place to live. We'll do all these great things, right? But they were also doing many illegal things too. They would intimidate many people to vote how they wanted them to vote. They would, do things like get people to double or even triple vote. So, these political machines not only did that, they were also, getting some sort of illegal kickbacks during this time period. So the progressives really wanted to put an end to all of this. Okay, so okay, let's see here. So looking at the chat here, somebody asked, kind of going back, somebody asked why lynching, couldn't they just point a gun at you? Remember, their goal was to, the goal of it was to scare people, right? And so it was to essentially terrorize the African American population, and that's why they used lynching. It was a way to send a message to terrorize those who, and kind of try and say, hey, look, this is what will happen to you if you try and stand up against us, or if trying to prevent others from essentially trying to fight for social justice at the time. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. So let's talk about some of the reforms of the state government that the progressives will introduce, right? So they're going to introduce many reforms that still sort of stand today, right? They're going to introduce many reforms such as initiative, referendum, and recall, all which are designed to end corruption and make the state government more directly accountable to the people, right? They also are going to support social legislation. Many of the progressives really make a big push at the state level, where they get many states to enact laws against things like child labor, unfair long work hours, injuries to workers. Because remember, we talked about how during the Gilded Age, right? Let's say you get hurt on the job. If, I don't know, like let's say you break a leg or something, right? And you're unable to work. What ended up happening back then was that you were just let go. You were fired. And somebody else took your spot. So there were laws that were passed eventually later on after this progressive movement to prevent those things from happening. Now, there's also laws that are going to be passed to also create wildlife preserves, but we'll talk more about that later on. Okay? So, some of the newly elected politicians at this time period, La Follette and then Theodore Roosevelt, they're going to take a lot of big steps to limit corruption and the influence of big businesses, and they're generally going to try and look out for the general well-being of the average everyday person. So, overall, here are some of the political reforms that go through, right? So there's the direct election of senators instead of by the state legislatures. There's the secret ballot. So the secret ballot, right? It is this today, right? If you go vote, no one can see who you're voting for. And the reason for that was that before, there used to be this guy standing by this box, kind of an exaggeration, but the basic gist of it was, because it really wasn't a secret ballot, they could really see who you're voting for, right? And they could kind of influence you. They can intimidate you, right? People from political machines, they could say, hey, like, why are you voting for this guy? You need to vote for my guy, right? So that's part of the reason why the secret ballot will be installed and still exists today. Now, an initiative is where voters, they can directly introduce bills into the state legislature, right? And, could vote on whether they wanted the bill to be passed. A referendum is this idea where voters can compel legislatures to place a bill on the ballot for approval. So what they can do is they can say, hey, like this bill, we want it on the ballot. You have to either vote yes or no, right? Um, the recall is where an elected official could be removed from office by voters in a special election. Okay, um, and then of course, last but not least, are direct party primaries, where there's these special elections that basically determine who the party members wanted to represent them in the general election. So, good example today is the presidential election, right? The Republican Party and the Democratic Party, they have their own primary election to see who's going to represent both their parties in the general presidential election. Okay? So has anyone got any questions so far about any of the reforms? All right. I think we're doing pretty good so far here. We got a little bit more to go through. Um, so one of the things that we mentioned before. Remember going back way back when, right? Hopefully everyone remembers what the spoils system was, right? This was a major problem in the government, and it you know the spoil system had been going on for some time already. Okay, it was this idea like, hey, I won the election. Let's say like I somehow in the future magically become president of the United States, right? And then I choose, if the civil service reform never happened, okay, under the spoils system, what I would do as president would be I would choose people who are my friends, even though they may not necessarily be qualified for those positions. Okay, so I would choose people who were loyal to me, who basically are going to say yes to me, and kind of support me, right? So in 1883, the Congress is going to pass what we call the Pendleton Act, which creates the Civil Service Commission. And the idea was this, right? They From then on, the commission is going to give exams and select appointees based off of their qualifications, right? And so, essentially, in order to become a civil servant or government official of some sort, you have to take this test. You have to show some sort of history of, hey, like I'm actually qualified to do this, or you have to show why you are qualified for that particular position. Okay, Theodore Roosevelt, or known as Teddy Roosevelt, will actually become the Civil Service Commissioner in 1889, and when he does, he's really going to focus on bringing a lot of different changes and ensuring that there's more qualified government officials being put into place. Okay, so checking the chat here, see if I missed anything. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on here. Ooh. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these political cartoons. We have looked at some of these before, right? Potentially, one or two of these may or may not show up in some way, shape, or form. Remember, if you're looking at this particular political cartoon, this is a political cartoon showing, if you look at the top, it says this is the Senate, right? And of course, you have the senators here, down here deliberating, maybe talking about a future bill that may be passed. Now, in the back, okay, obviously these guys all represent trusts, monopolies. If you see here, there's the steel beam trust, the copper trust, Standard Oil, which is Rockefeller's, right? So this political cartoon is essentially saying, right, that the real people who are running the government at the time were trusts, not government officials. Okay, so this is saying, if you look at the very bottom here, it says the bosses of the Senate, right? Now, this right here, if you look very closely, right, okay, this one is talking about what? Okay, what is this political cartoon talking about? If you look very closely, what I want you to pay attention to is who are the workers who are rowing the oars, right? And then I want you to look at that little poster to the upper right, if you can see it. It's child labor, right? Good. So this is a political cartoon criticizing, right, child labor. So, no, you cannot use this political cartoon for your Gilded Age newspaper project, okay? You got to create your own. So, this is showing that, hey, like, this is the company greed, right? These children are being forced to work for them, okay? Because if you know your world history, right, okay, if you look in the background, this is a ancient Greece ship, if I'm looking at that right? And so the idea was like the people who would row these ships typically, right, in ancient Greece were slaves. And these children are essentially being considered what in this political cartoon? And you got any ideas? Who are these children? So the children are essentially what? Slaves. Okay, good, right? So they're slaves to the industries, like they they're working, they are getting paid, but right, even though they're getting paid, they're not getting paid very, very much. Some of them are, right? Some of them are. So remember, sometimes children were forced to work in dangerous conditions because they were smaller, like we talked about, right? Or sometimes they were forced to. Sometimes they were forced to go into coal mines, right, into tight spots that were extremely dangerous, and sometimes the children, because they were smaller, they had smaller hands, they were, basically forced to work on machines that adults, their hands could not fit in, and sometimes bad things would happen to them. So, this is kind of showing that, right? If you look here to the lower left, right, this is showing that, hey, like, some of these children, they're either passing out or they're about to fall over, right? This is kind of showing all these different things, okay? So, let's kind of recap a little bit here about what we learned, okay? So, we didn't talk too much about yellow journalism. We'll talk more about it when we get to the Spanish-American War, but kind of quickly summing it up real fast, yellow journalism is really just, you're really exaggerating something, right? You take an idea, you take something, right, some sort of political cartoon, and then you kind of really exaggerate in order to try and either convince somebody or kind of prove your point, right? So let's see what else here am I missing. I think we got almost everything. At the bottom, there's two things that we're going to cover in class. There's the Pure Food and Drug Act, right? So this is going to be actually the Pure Food and Drug Act will be released as a result of the progressive era investigations, right? Uh, so I would agree. One of our viewers, right? They've said that BuzzFeed is yellow journalism, right? So you could consider that, right? So it's like, hey, I'm trying to get everyone's attention. I'm trying to sell this product, right? So how can I get people to buy this, right? So let's see here. What else have we missed out on? The Pure Food and Drug Net. So basically, this is going to be passed as a result of, especially of Upton Sinclair's investigations, right? About the meat packaging industries, about what's going on. And so this act was passed as a result to try and curb some of that's going on. If you haven't read yet, right, please make sure you read about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. It is one of the major reasons why today we have fire code, where, you know, things like if you're inside of a building, like in a public building, like when we're in school, right, the doors, they can't be locked from the inside. And what I mean by that is that the doors can never prevent you from leaving, right? There's certain fire code that everyone has to follow, and a lot of it is going to be a result of the tragic Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Okay, so make sure y'all read that about page 630, and then kind of just take some notes, try and review, right? This is one of the easier chapters to go over, so make sure you keep up, okay? All right, so we're going to go ahead and end it there. Hopefully everyone at least has a decent idea about what's going on, right, for this particular chapter. Okay, so if anyone has any questions about what we covered, just let me know right now. I'm going to take a few questions here for about 5 to 10 minutes about anything that you may have general questions about, and then, you know, I'll be signing off. No, Tien, I will not play video games with you. Okay, so does anyone have any serious questions? No, that was just an essay practice that we did in class. We'll probably do at least, yeah, we'll probably do about 2-3 streams a week. One for every chapter. So going forward, we're gonna try and at least do one stream a week, try and get everyone into this. For the political cartoons, they don't have to be that great. Okay, so remember, I'm grading off of the content, not about not the art quality itself, right? Okay. Oh goodness. All right. So if no one has any questions about the chapter, we're gonna go ahead and log out for today. Okay, we had a pretty successful day. So we're going to go ahead and log out. All right. Hopefully everyone have a good night. Make sure you read, do your homework, and everyone have a good night.